Okay, this will be my presentation on the IS curve. So before we talk about the IS curve, we need to talk about the ISMP model. The ISMP model consists of three different curves. First, we have the IS curve, which represents equilibrium for goods and services in the market. Second, we have the MP curve, which represents the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. And third, we have the Phillips curve, which represents the relationship between the output gap, or the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate. Now we can talk about the IS curve. So the IS curve is a curve in the ISMP model that shows us the combination of real interest rates and aggregate output that represents equilibrium in the market for goods and services. The IS curve, along with the monetary policy curve, will help to determine the position and shape of the aggregate demand curve. So in order to do that, we need to look at the goods market equilibrium. So the key idea behind the ISMP model is that changes in aggregate expenditure will cause changes in real GDP. Economists define aggregate expenditure, which can also be called total spending on real GDP, as the sum of consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports. So below here we can see the formula where we have aggregate expenditure is equal to consumption, investments, government spending, net exports. Now, equilibrium will occur when the value of all goods and services demanded, which is also aggregate expenditure, is equal to the value of goods and services produced, which is real GDP or Y. So we can see that A is also equal to Y. So let's look at the IS curve and the aggregate demand curve. So here we have the aggregate demand curve for aggregate expenditure. And here we can see some of the things that will happen when we manipulate these different factors. So if AE is smaller than Y, we can see that aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP, then some of the goods that were produced were not purchased, and therefore inventories will rise and real GDP and employment will decline. So we can see that an unplanned increase in inventories will cause a decrease in output. Then, if AE is larger than Y, we will see that spending was greater than the amount of goods that were produced. And because of that, inventories will fall, and then real GDP and employment will increase. Here we see an unplanned decrease in inventories will cause an increase in output. Now we have movements along the IS curve. So a change in real interest rates can affect consumption, investments, and net exports. This will result in a movement along the IS curve. So a decrease in the real interest rate increases consumption because it gives consumers an incentive to spend rather than save and will reduce the cost of borrowing. A decrease in the real interest rate increases investment spending because it makes firms more willing to invest in equipment, and it makes households more likely to purchase new houses. A decrease in the domestic real interest rate makes returns on domestic financial assets less attractive to investors in comparison to other foreign assets, which will decrease the exchange rate. The decrease in exchange rate will increase exports and decrease imports, which will overall increase net exports. An increase in real interest rates will decrease consumption, decrease investments, and decrease net exports, which is just vice versa for these first examples. So now we need to look at what shifts the IS curve, and a shift is different than a movement along the curve. This is actually shifting the curve in one direction or another. So changes to consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports will result in a shift of the IS curve. So for example, if there is increased wealth in the economy, this will cause consumers to consume more. Increased government spending, businesses being more optimistic about the future so that investments increase, or other countries importing more Canadian goods will cause net exports to increase. So all of these things will shift the IS curve to the right, and vice versa. So we also need to review the output gap. So economists believe that the output gap is the most accurate way to measure how far away the economy is from potential GDP. The output gap measures how efficiently the economy is employing its resources, such as labor, natural resources, and human capital. The output gap represents the percentage deviation of actual real GDP from potential GDP. Now, we can use the output gap in conjunction with the IS curve. So we can use the output gap in place of real GDP when analyzing the ISMP model in order to calculate potential GDP. So any amount to the left of this curve or this line will show us the deviation negative from potential GDP, or anything to the right will show us the deviation in a positive direction away from potential GDP. So here's a question. So, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government of Zimbabwe has increased their spending from 380 million in 2020 to 550 million in 2021. How will this impact the IS curve for Zimbabwe? So, we just need to go back and remember that we need to figure out whether it will shift the IS curve or be a movement along the demand curve, or the IS curve, pardon me. And since the government spending has increased, we are going to see that the IS curve will shift to the right. And because of this, we will see an overall increase of real interest rates. And here are my citations, everything I got, including those useful graphs. This one and this one were all found in our textbook, the Harvard R. Glenn, Kaninsky, J.D. O'Brien, Patrick and Rafferty Macroeconomics Canadian edition.